Wow. I think you guys really want to hear about what on earth is going on in the world. Welcome to tonight's event. I am extremely excited that you're here. A couple of things to mention ahead of time. The first is that on Thursdays, which today is, we have a new publication that comes out every week about something that tonight's event is about, which is on foreign affairs. It's a kind of wonky deep dive into foreign policy options and everything ranging from rising tides to refugee issues to just about anything you can think about. And it's what we wish the candidates and their staffs were reading and immersing themselves with. And so we're just putting it out there as the record of here are the most pressing questions in foreign affairs, the ones that don't quite make it into the headlines. And I invite you to look at it. It's fascinating, and you should read the one that came out this week, but the last 15 issues as well, and the next 15 issues. So I just wanted to start by saying that. And thank you all for being here. So,
I want to be able to see this one.
okay, good.
Yeah, just so I wanted to be able to see the other people there that's training this.
No one ever told me I was blocking before. Okay. So,
Sorry.
So it's okay. Right, we're good.
Good.
Yeah,
We're
okay.
good. We're good.
Okay. So we're joined tonight by two. I'm just so lucky, and so are you. To my far right is Ken Dilanian. I'm sure you all know him from seeing him on television. And he has graciously decided to help this discussion out here. He's, as you know, the national security correspondent for NBC News. But today, he has a piece out. He's had many pieces out, I have to say, about this issue. But he has a piece out just before this gathering on the initial consequences and mindset of foreign policy officials after the Soleimani attack, and then sort of the long-term strategic issues that have to do with the region, the United States, and actually, the way I read it, the world. So he's going to help me out here a little bit, right?
Glad to.
A lot. You're going to help me out. Okay. And to my closer right is John Brennan. He's a distinguished fellow at the Center on National Security here at the law school. I know many of you have seen him many times before. But before, we've been talking about sort of wide-ranging, somewhat theoretical issues, somewhat. And today we're really here to talk about something very specific. And the killing of Soleimani is a entry to what we really need to talk about, which is, what are we doing? And under what authorities are we doing it? And what do we need to change? And what do we need to keep the same? And so I really actually don't think there's anybody I would rather hear from on this topic than John Brennan, who's a fellow here at the center, as I said, and who we've had many conversations over the couple of years that you've been here. And I think this killing brings together so many of the issues that you've talked to classes about, that you've been thinking about, and that your 30-year plus career in government at the CIA and at the White House has led you not just to think about, but to have to make decisions about. So I wanted to start with talking about Soleimani himself. And I wanted to ask, Admiral Stavridis the other day referred to him as an equivalent, if you wanted to understand his ranking within the Iranian government. He said that he was the equivalent to General Eisenhower, which I was kind of a little bit surprised by that. And I just wondered, is there even an equivalent? Is that a logical way to talk? And how should we understand it when we hear pundits on different sides of different channels saying he is really important apparatus of the government, he's separate from the government doing his own thing? How do we understand this?
Well, first of all, Karen, thank you so much for the invitation to be here. It's always great to be back at Fordham. I very much look forward to these events. It's hard for me to think about an equivalency between General Dwight D. Eisenhower, that basically defeated Nazi forces in World War II, and Qasem Soleimani. Eisenhower was the head of all the US military. Qasem Soleimani, for a number of years, was the head of the Al-Quds Force, which was the Iranian Revolutionary Guard paramilitary organization that had tremendous reach throughout the region. Qasem Soleimani was one of a principal nemesis of mine, during my time in government. He was exceptionally active, unfortunately very, very innovative and ingenious in terms of how he was pushing back, in his view, against those forces that were trying to undermine Iran. But in addition to heading up the Quds Force, he also had tremendous, especially over time, political influence in Tehran. Khamenei considered Qasem Soleimani in some respects like a son. He had a very special relationship with Qasem Soleimani, yes, and he relied on him heavily. And I really do believe those tears that Khamenei shed at the time of Soleimani's death were real, because Soleimani, although he has, I think, had a very well-deserved reputation for being very aggressive and using whatever tools he might have at his disposal, he also, though, I think, played the political environment in Tehran masterfully. And so therefore, he was able to get Khamenei's support on a lot of these matters. And that's why I think Khamenei right now, and the Iranian government overall, I think is still struggling with how to deal with a lot of this, what's going on right now, because you don't have the voice of Soleimani in that inner council. And so there is basically a vacuum there from the standpoint of somebody who knows the region very well, has had tremendous contacts with everybody in the region. And so there really is a void now, I think, within the Iranian hierarchy. So again, I wouldn't make any equivalency with Eisenhower, but Soleimani's influence was extensive, it was deep, it was very much shaping of the Iranian approach to the Middle East for many years. Qasem Soleimani, in the eyes of many Iranians, even though he has this reputation of being this bloodthirsty terrorist, he was the face of Iranian resistance to Sunni extremism in the region that was seen as a real existential threat to Iran and Shia Islam. He also was the face of resistance to what was viewed by many people, and still is, as U.S. intervention in the region. U.S. presence in Iraq, U.S. presence in Afghanistan, the two big countries on Iran's borders. And so he was seen as this resistance figure who not only orchestrated the Al-Quds Force to do things and make trouble, but also to develop the relationships with Hezbollah in Lebanon, with the Houthis in Yemen, with the Shia in Bahrain, with the popular militias in Iraq. Soleimani was a very, very engaged individual that really was one of the shapers of the political and military events over the last several decades. So he's taken out of that equation, and I think Iran is still grappling with what his absence means in terms of the inner sanctum of Iranian decision-making, as well as how are they going to maintain this resistance that they still believe is existential. His former deputy, who's now the head, Ismail Ghani, is a long-term deputy of Soleimani, but he doesn't have the charisma. He certainly saw the administrative aspects, but he doesn't have those relationships that Soleimani had. Soleimani was always on the move, always going somewhere, and had developed those networks of contacts and really developed a lot of allegiance on the part of these Shia organizations to him, and therefore by extension to Iran. So again, the impact of his loss is, I think, far-reaching, and the Iranians are still, I think, trying to figure out where to go from here.
That's really interesting, because a lot of some of the journalists that have weighed in and experts have said, "Oh my God," because we don't know who's going to replace him, and it could be much worse. But there hasn't been much there. So basically, what you're saying is that's going to be a much harder to achieve, not just because of the position, because of the personality, the long-standing ties, et cetera, like that.
Yes, that doesn't mean that Al-Quds Force is not going to still be a threat. It doesn't mean that the potential for Iranian-sponsored violence against U.S. and U.S. interests in the region is going to go away, not by any means. But when you take out someone as consequential as Soleimani, it really has had quite an impact.
Interesting. And that's part of what the White House would say. So, right, and in the options that were presented to the president and the reporting was that, just take them out. Kind of he went for that option of all the options. And I guess there's a lot to talk about in that, but first thing I wanted to just ask is, seeing as we're at a law school, how we think about the legality of that. In international law, if you're in an armed conflict and you, under very limited circumstances of self-defense, this could have been, you can have an allowable strike, but we're not in a hot war with Iran, or are we? You can turn to that. And then I think the other question is, domestically, what does it mean for us to have conducted this strike? And is there a legal basis for that? I mean, Jack Goldsmith, professor at Harvard, law professor at Harvard, has come down very strongly on the side that it was a legal strike. Your thoughts?
I don't agree. I don't agree. Even though, as I said, I think the impact of Soleimani's death is significant, and at least in the short term, I think has maybe mitigated some of the threat that is posed. But in terms of self-defense, it usually is, if you're in a naval vessel or something, someone's coming at you, you have to react. It's the principle of self-defense that you can take those actions. I have seen nothing whatsoever that said that Soleimani was going to, at that point, authorize a strike. He certainly was not going to strap an IED on his body, which is what usually happens. But even more fundamentally, there's a great distinction in my mind between a strike against an unlawful combatant, which by Geneva Convention and a lot of other important, foundations, says that a person who is carrying out conflict on behalf of a sovereign state has certain protections. Now, we're not at war with Iran, right? We have struck Al-Qaeda terrorists, numerous times, but they are unlawful combatants. I see no equivalency, either in law or a domestic or international law, that striking a government official of a foreign country that you're not in war with has a legal basis. It's certainly not covered under any of the existing authorizations for the use of military force, AUMF, in Iraq, as well as against terrorist forces. No basis on that. And I disagree with not just Goldsmith, but a lot of very good former colleagues of mine in the military who say that, of course, he was a legitimate military target. Well, what gives the United States, just because we can do it, and in fact we can get away with it, to say that we want to take out a foreign government official, even if they're engaged in these types of activities, because a person who is in the Oval Office says do it? Now, as people remember, in the 1970s, you had those congressional hearings, the Church hearings, committee in the Senate, and the Pike hearings in the House of Representatives, that exposed a lot of wrongdoing on the part of the U.S. government. That the CIA was involved in a lot of these extra-legal killings. And there was then the executive order that was passed by Gerald Ford in '76, I believe, it was 11907, I believe, that banned assassination. Basically say that the United States government should not, in fact, be just killing people of foreign governments because we want to do it. No. And so, therefore, I cannot understand how people can say it is legal, domestically or internationally, for the United States to carry out an assassination against a senior military officer who is part of a sovereign state. If that's the case, by that rationale, we take out the head of the Russian SVR or the FSB, because they're involved in certain types of activities, as awful as they might be in terms of poisoning. But we believe that we can then strike them, and we have the legal base to do it. Absent hostilities, right. And this is where the big issue right now is with the Congress, the declaration of war, that's a whole other issue. But I cannot see that what this administration did against Soleimani has any legal basis, and certainly is very dissimilar from the strikes against unlawful combatants belonging to Al-Qaeda or any of the other terrorist groups that are in fact named in the authorization for the use of military force that has been in existence since 2001.
So this big distinction between state and non-state actor, which is sort of taking the non-state actor paradigm and how it was used and rationale, and just sort of this mission creep immediately, without any kind of run-up, actually, to state actors, in part influenced by the fact that there have been the use of proxies, right? And how this difficulty of distinguishing between a proxy actor and a state actor, and it sort of just wiped out the cloudiness that comes with that, and just, right? I mean, there's some bizarre threshold that I think we crossed by going after a state actor under authorities that were always directed at non-state actors.
Right. I mean, this was intentionally targeted against a senior Iranian military officer who was inside of Iraq. And it was not as though he was on the battlefield or whatever, but it was, got off the plane, was in his car, and then was struck. And maybe there's something also about the very impersonal nature, of sorts, of remotely piloted vehicles, drones, predators, whatever, which is a tremendously capable weapon of war that is able to carry out these strikes with tremendous precision and also limit civilian casualties, and has been used very effectively against Al-Qaeda. But is there any difference between that and somebody going up and shooting somebody in the head? There seems to be a distinction.
Well, there's some distinction in that the person, when you have a drone strike, an unmanned aerial vehicle, there's no person that could be killed that's delivering the...
Oh, well, you're reducing, sure, you're reducing the risk to the individuals who are doing it, and that's why it's opted for, because you can dwell over the target and all of those reasons. That's why it's a tremendously capable weapon of war. Yeah. But it's still an assassination, it's still a killing.
Yeah.
And so in the Obama administration, at least, for every decision that was made to strike a terrorist, there was a rigorous review that had to determine that there was no other way to mitigate the threat that that person posed except by the use of lethal force. And before striking that individual, there had to be near certainty that that was the person, near certainty that there'd be no civilian casualties. There was no possibility of capture by either US forces or by local forces. So it went through that review, and it had to meet that criteria in order for it to be an authorized strike.
Right.
And so on the Soleimani issue, again, at least so far the administration has not come out with saying, and its reasons for the strike have varied depending on who says it and what day. But again, to me, I think it's a tremendous threshold to reach in order to kill an official of a foreign government by the unilateral actions of the United States.
Right.
How would we feel if, let's say, the Iranians or somebody else said, well, a U.S. military officer in the region who is, training Iraqi forces that are going after the Iranian-supported militia, or inside of Afghanistan that are going after Iranian-supported groups there, that military officer was a legitimate target? Say no. So again, the impact of the strike, I think, was significant. I believe it did mitigate things in the near term. I do not believe his death has been avenged at all yet. The concept of an eye for an eye in the Middle East among the Iranians is very strong. And whether or not Tehran, the government in Tehran, authorizes a strike, the strike they did against the base in Iraq with U.S. forces was a strike for domestic catharsis. There had to be some type of Iranian acknowledged strike against the U.S. in order to say to the Iranian people, we're not going to just turn a blind eye to this. What Iran might do now clandestinely, or what other groups might decide to do either at Tehran's direction or on their own, I think is to be seen. And we know that the Iranians have long memories. We know that they can be patient. And so I believe that there are some in Iran who will want to avenge Soleimani's death with blood, not with brain injuries.
Ken, that brings us right to you. You want to ask a few
Well,
things based
on this
what you
point
read
about rationale, John, I wonder if you think it makes a difference that the Trump administration designated Soleimani as a terrorist, and they've designated the Quds Force as a terrorist organization. So he's not just a state actor; they consider him also to be a terrorist. And could you talk about, they've said he's killed hundreds of Americans. How should we understand?
Well,
that?
every administration over the last 30 or 40 years has identified countries as state sponsors. It was North Korea, it was Iran, there's Syria, there was Iraq, there was Cuba on there for a long time, Sudan, others. That did not, though, empower, or the administration did not believe that empowered them to just take strikes against officials of those countries. The Trump administration decided to designate the Al-Quds Force a subset of the Iranian government. There were proposals in the Obama administration from members of Congress to do that as well, the Quds Force. And if you start doing that, then you're going to start going down this slippery slope about designated individuals and individual groups in it. We certainly were opposed to it. I don't believe, again, that I will call it an arbitrary determination on the part of the Trump administration to say that's a terrorist organization inside of the Iranian government, which then allows us to strike at them independent of any other legal basis or even congressional approval. So, the fact that they had that designated to me does not justify it. It's a way for them to rationalize it. And again, I'm not a lawyer. I never was able to get to Fordham Law School. But there are, I think, a lot of questions that need to be looked at here because, again, this can be a slippery slope. And again, I see a real distinction between unlawful combatants, whether you're talking about Hezbollah, you're talking about Al-Qaeda, you're talking about Shabab, you're talking about any number of these organizations that engage in terrorist attacks that I think the United States has not just a moral requirement to go after, but also a very strong domestic and international legal basis to do so.
Can you talk about, you mentioned this a little bit, but the CIA has gotten very good at manhunting. I mean, this is a capability to track this man, to get him off the plane, to follow him with drones that was not even imagined 20 years ago. And it's something that you were closely involved in both the White House and at the CIA, and we've perfected it over the years. And does that make a president more likely to use that capability, the better they get at finding people?
Well, that increased capability is a result of two things. One is that every place we go these days in the digital environment, we leave digital dust. My phone, and my credit card, my, you name it, CCTVs that are all around. It's virtually impossible for people to move around. You get on the internet or whatever else, that it is not difficult at all to learn through legal means and then through government means where somebody is at what time. It's made it very difficult, in fact, for CIA and other intelligence organizations to be able to operate clandestinely overseas, when years ago you could do a lot of things. Now it's very difficult because you have this digital environment that is always on. And so, depending on who you are and who's looking for you, you can be blinking red. So at the same time of this very busy digital dust environment, you also have now enhanced capabilities to identify and track it. And also the increasing refinement and advancements in technology about putting ordnance on target. And so, as mentioned before, with Predators, or remotely piloted vehicles that initially we used just for surveillance purposes, full motion video, you can look from miles away and you can have this grainy video you see. It also can suck up a lot of technical signals. And then you combine that with other platforms, you can really have tremendous fidelity as far as where somebody is. And then, because of, again, tremendous technological advancements, you can put missiles on target within inches. And you also can, if somebody gets into the target zone where you're going to hit, you can also steer it away from that last minute. So I think the richness now of this environment has made it a lot easier, not just for U.S. military and intelligence capabilities to be able to track and find people, but also for other entities, not just other intelligence security services, but as we well know, in the business and commercial world, all of a sudden you seem to express interest on the internet of some type of new basketball, and all of a sudden you get inundated with emails about basketball shoes and shirts and whatever else. because there's a tremendous ability to correlate and to integrate data and information at the speed of light. And it can be done so quickly and automatically, which then raises and goes into the issue of machine learning and artificial intelligence, so that you can put in those algorithms that it ingests so much data, and then certain actions are taken as a result of the input. And it raises very serious questions about, at what point should those actions that result from the machine learning and the ingestion of data require human intervention?
I want to ask you about the strategic implications. After this happened, when I reached out to some of your former colleagues who worked this target, they were absolutely stunned that the Trump administration took this action. And as you know, it had been contemplated in the past. People have written about chances they had to kill this man, but it was just considered off the table. It was considered so risky. Some of the reporting we did tonight was that we were maybe closer to war with Iran in the wake of this strike than more commonly understood. How risky was it, do you think, to take this action?
It's impossible for me to answer that, because I am not privy to the intelligence that undergirded the decision, whether or not we were close to an actual war. I don't believe Iran wants to have a conventional war with the United States. They will engage in asymmetric pressure and even attacks. But there's no way that Iran wants that type of. Now, it may come to that, and at some point they may decide, well, we're going to go down in flames, and we're going to take a lot of others with us. And we know that they have the capability to, launch missiles against Gulf states and other things. But I don't know what it was that really prompted that decision on the part of Trump. But I think if what you're hearing from some of my former colleagues, that they were surprised that decision was taken, it sounds, if they were privy to the intelligence, then they didn't believe the intelligence really required that type of action. Now, one can say that, well, what Trump did, has a real net plus for the United States. Well, and it might be that up to this point, it does. I think the determination about whether or not this was a wise strike, even if it might have been illegal or even unnecessary, I think determining whether or not it was wise will have to wait some period of time. I remember back in, 1991, when Hezbollah leader Moussawi was killed, allegedly by Israeli helicopter gunships, along with his wife and child or whatever. It was a tremendous jolt to Hezbollah. Well, what was it, about 6 months later, the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires was bombed with a lot of dead Israeli diplomats as well as civilians. And I have no doubt in my mind that that was payback for the Moussawi killing. So I don't know what's being hatched right now in Iran. I do not believe that what they do next, if they do something, and I believe they will, I do not believe they're going to take credit for it. And what happens if tomorrow a U.S. ambassador in the region is killed, or a U.S. senior military officer is killed, or let's say even a member of Congress, and it's claimed to be to avenge the death of Soleimani, but yet we don't have the intelligence that Iran directed it, right. Or in fact we have the intelligence that they didn't. What do we do then? Do we go after the proxy group that carried out the attack, or the individual? Maybe it's Soleimani's family member who decided to do it. So I think we still have to be a bit cautious as far as what the reaction to the Soleimani death is. It may seem like it was a long time ago because so much has happened since then. It's still very early, I think, in the gestation period for what might happen and who might authorize it and against what target.
Speaking of deniability, some of your former colleagues have said it would have been smarter to do this as a covert operation and not claim credit for it. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, if Soleimani was going with Mohandas, the head of the Iraqi popular militias, in that vehicle, and there is a missile that comes out of the sky and near Baghdad airport, I'm sure the Iraqis are not going to claim credit for it, and I'm sure they're going to deny it. So who else would it have been? Right. That's something very difficult to deny when you actually carry out that type of strike. But might it have been better not to acknowledge something like that? Might have been, but I just think it'd be very difficult to deny it.
Which brings us to the authorization for the use of military force. So today in Congress, Barbara Lee introduced a resolution to sunset the 2002 authorization for the war in Iraq. We
She
still
was the one person in Congress who voted against it.
I know.
Yeah.
Well, so that it's, things come around. So, but now we still have the 2001 authorization for the use of military force. At different times, the Trump administration pointed to each one of these for the authorization for the strike against Soleimani. Given the scenario you've just laid out for the decisions that might be in front of the White House coming down the pike in light of this incident, do we need a new AUMF? And if so, how would we begin to think about its focus, its limits? What would be your thoughts?
Well, this does get to the issue of what is Congress's role as far as approving the use of U.S. military overseas, outside of a real training and assist mission. Clearly, there's engagements inside of Iraq that really put U.S. forces in the crosshairs. I really have changed my views on this issue over the last several years. Mm-hmm. When I was in the Obama administration, because I had such tremendous respect for Obama and we had very similar views about the use of military force and the limits and constraints on it that need to be imposed. I also felt that the Congress really impeded President Obama's ability to do certain things, such as close Guantanamo. I felt very frustrated over that. And I felt that the Congress's intervention was really counterproductive to the ability of the chief executive and the commander-in-chief to carry out responsible policies. That was during the Obama years. Now during the Trump years, I feel as though, my goodness, where's Congress? And so but I have to be careful also, because I think we also as a country have to be careful about not totally reshaping the architecture of our federal government because of Mr. Trump. Mm-hmm. I think we have to be very, very careful about that. I don't think, he clearly is an anomaly. And he clearly is doing some things that I think would not have been expected of anybody that we thought would make their way to the Oval Office. And so he's trampling a lot of the foundations of our democratic republic. And I think he's also demonstrating a real lawlessness. And so that's the struggle now. What do you do when you have a lawless president? I would put the Soleimani killing in that bucket. It's an example of it, just the way, clearly this is going astray, but clearly what he did with Ukraine, it was far beyond, what, a president should be doing. So are we going to reshape our governmental architecture to prevent somebody as unprincipled, unethical, and lawless as a Donald Trump from doing these types of things? If we do that, we're also going to prevent the ethical, principled, good people from both the Democratic and Republican Party or whatever party might be out there from doing what is necessary without being tied down to what I think frequently is 535 members of Congress who have difficulty working together and doing things in a timely fashion that's going to keep this country strong. So I think the challenge for this country and for the U.S. government looking out over the next several decades is how are we going to ensure, as Benjamin Franklin said, it's a republic if you can keep it. How are you going to ensure that the mechanisms of government are going to be robust enough and flexible enough, but also interdependent enough that will allow those responsible, elected and otherwise, to do their jobs and not hamstring it in a way because there may in fact be a fool who's going to get elected at some point in the future.
So that.
It's not that I feel strongly about the matter, but.
So in other words, just to cut. So in other words, so much of what we do. Let's just stick with the foreign policy, whether it's Ukraine or Iran. it depends on keeping our fingers crossed that we have a president we can trust to operate in a procedural, lawful way.
Well, we have to find a way to, not just to have our fingers crossed and hope.
Right. So,
But I do think in this very challenging world where there are a lot of issues on the national security front that require a very judicious, wise, but also timely reaction, response, or approach, a commander-in-chief, the chief executive, the president of the United States needs to be able to wield the great power of the United States in a manner that is going to best protect this country. And I disagreed with some of the things that George W. Bush did. The invasion of Iraq was, I think he was pushed into that by the advisors, the neocons who really want to do that. I never doubted for a minute, though, that his decisions were made in a way that he thought was in the best interest of the United States. And it wasn't done for his own personal benefit or his own partisan benefit. It was because he thought that was the right thing to do. Obviously, the same thing with Obama, same thing with Clinton, same thing with George H.W. Bush, Reagan, others before him. But now we have a much different situation. So I think this really has shaken some of the foundations of our country. You can have the policy disagreements. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about an understanding and a respect for the constitutional underpinnings of this government and this country and what a president of the United States is supposed to be doing, as opposed to saying, Article 2 allows me to do anything I want.
yeah, read it, he said. Read it.
It's absurd.
Do you have a?
Well, I wonder, you sort of alluded to this in the beginning. Do you think that this strike, though you disagree with it, has reestablished some level of deterrence, has put Iran back on its heels, and in that way was somewhat successful?
Again, I don't know what it might have been ready to do. Mm-hmm. So I don't know whether or not this eliminated, at least in the near term, whatever action was going to take place. I do think it has rocked the Iranians, and I think it has rocked Khamenei. And so I think it's forced them to take time to reassess and to figure out the way to go forward. But looking at it from the Iranian perspective, this economic strangulation of Iran that has been imposed by the Trump administration, particularly with the secondary and tertiary sanctions, and requiring Europeans and others to abide by those sanctions, it is strangling the breath out of the Iranians. The United States right now is an existential threat to the Iranian government. The status quo is unacceptable to the Iranians. They have limited options at this point. I think they're trying to figure out how they're going to get out of this. Might they just be waiting and hope that the November election is going to result in a different administration that is going to reinstitute the JCPOA and then, remove the sanctions that have been put on it? I don't know. Might the Iranians try to do something in the run-up to the November election to try to enhance the prospects of whoever it might be to run against Trump? I don't know. But I know the administration says our aim is not to topple the regime. Really? Of course it is. The Obama administration took an approach that trying to topple the regime is really full of a lot of risks. You're going to have a lot of people dead, and it could set off the region. And it was an approach to try to incrementally move Iran in the right direction, strengthening the moderates, the people like President Rouhani and others, and Zarif. But by tearing up the U.S. commitment to the JCPOA, it took the rug right out from under the moderates in Iran. And so now, what are the Iranians going to do? Well, Iran, just like the United States, is a polarized country. And a lot of times when people talk about Iran, they talk about it like it's a monolith. It's not. You have different views in that country. And so what might the Iranians be thinking about? I don't know. This latest peace plan that was put forward by the Trump administration, which is, again, on its face, absurd. I wonder whether or not it's going to stir up some agitation among Palestinians that, in fact, the Iranians in the past have certainly used Hamas and others. Might the Iranians try to do some things to thwart and frustrate U.S. interests in the region? I think their National Security Council probably is thinking about what options they have. and they don't have a lot of options on that diplomatic front. And how are they going to use pressure against the United States?
So following up on U.S. Influence in the region, what about Saudi Arabia? You know Saudi well. You were a station chief there. One of the stories that's been reported in the Middle East press and a little bit in the press here is that there have been talks going on between Saudi Arabia and Iran about reducing tensions. And that some of the stories said that Soleimani was actually in Baghdad to be part of those discussions. What about Saudi Arabia and all of this? It hasn't been talked about a lot. How do we
I think Mohammed Salman, when he became the day-to-day decision maker in Saudi Arabia, had a very exaggerated view of what the Saudis could accomplish, either with their military, such as in Yemen, or with their checkbook diplomacy, or with their powers of persuasion. Obviously, Mohammed Salman has established a very good relationship with the Trump administration. And so between MBS in Saudi Arabia and MBZ and the UAE, I think they were pushing for a much more aggressive posture on the part of the United States toward Iran because of this longstanding Shia-Sunni, Iran-Saudi, tension over the years. But I think Mohammed Salman might have had a sobering moment when the Iranians very effectively, using remotely piloted aircraft, took out a lot of the very important oil facilities in Upcake, the large oil facility in Saudi Arabia, really knocking out 40% or so of Saudi oil production exports. And I think the Saudis and MBS recognize that if there's a big war, if there's a real war, the Saudis are probably going to take it on the chin. And I think MBS would prefer to avoid that. Might there be some of these secret discussions going on between Saudi Arabia and Iran? Yeah. The Saudis and Iranians have had contacts over the years. And depending on who the interlocutors were, Rafsanjani of Iran, former prime minister there, was president there, was a person who was in contact with the Saudis over the years, former Crown Prince Abdullah, and even when he was king. So there might have been these discussions to see whether or not there could be some type of resolution. Maybe the Iranians were really hoping that the Saudis could, in fact, encourage Washington to be a little bit less reckless and aggressive in terms of its posture toward Iran. Every year the Saudis worry that the Iranians are going to stir up problems in the Hajj that takes place in Mecca. I would not dismiss them, but I cannot say that I know anything about it.
We're going to open up for questions for a few minutes, but first I wanted to ask you about the elephant in the room, which is the impeachment question. What are your thoughts that you'd like to share with us on what's going on in Washington right now?
Oh, boy.
How much time do you have?
We can be here all night.
No, they have to ask questions. We can't be here all night.
Well, there are so many dimensions of this thing. I think anybody who knows the facts and knows the law and understands exactly what happened vis-a-vis Ukraine and that military assistance cannot but come to the conclusion that Donald Trump was trying to get Ukrainian support to do something that was going to benefit him politically. And denying that is like denying that the earth revolves around the sun. I mean, there's no denying it unless you are someone who is exceptionally partisan and believes that the end justifies the means. And by that I mean that they're going to turn a blind eye, as they have done for over 3 years, at all of the transgressions of Mr. Trump, because they get the judges that they want, that they get the reduction in regulations, they do all those other things, and so they don't care about his dishonesty, unprincipled nature, and they're hoping that he is going to get reelected. And unfortunately, I think the Republicans in the Senate and the Congress, I am just appalled, and I know many of them, having worked with them, and I am just shocked that they have totally checked their ethics and principles at the door, and now will do anything and everything to try to ensure that Donald Trump stays in office and allows them to maintain their position in the government. am watching the impeachment hearings also, and I would love to be able to just sit in on a Fordham Law School class on the issue of ethics and defense attorneys. And I see in the Donald Trump's bevy of lawyers up there, I make a distinction between the government officials, the White House counsel, Pat Cipollone, and his deputy, Pat Philbin, and then you have the Dershowitzes and Starrs and Rays and Sekulows and others. But I've listened to the government lawyers just outright misrepresent, mischaracterize, and lie about the facts. And I wonder at what point does a government official who takes an oath will continue to do these types of things purely to ensure that Donald Trump is not held to account for what clearly he did. And so, and I know everybody is privileged to have a defense whenever they're accused of any type of crime. And I'm sure it's a struggle, but I think there has to be bounds of what especially government lawyers are going to do. Again, the private lawyers, I was talking to a good friend, a very good legal mind last night about Alan Dershowitz after listening to his talk yesterday. And my lawyer friend gave me the technical term of what Dershowitz was doing, and that's he's lost his marbles. Because he clearly has. There's a cravenness right now in Washington among politicians that just refuse to do what is right. And then you can have very respected attorneys or well-known, some lawyers with big egos, to go up and do anything possible to get somebody off. And so, and again, not being trained in law school, and I'm not making an equivalency here, but if somebody is, let's say, a mass murderer or whatever, and the lawyer representing them knows, in fact, that they've just killed 20 people, incontrovertible evidence, will they look for some type of legal technicality or some type of very creative legal approach to get them acquitted? That's why I could never be in that position. But I do think certainly that government officials have a responsibility to not purposely, intentionally misrepresent
I think that's right.
facts.
And I think you make a very good point about defense attorneys, and I think there's a big difference between what's going on right now in Washington and what most defense attorneys think of is their job. And I think a lot of this comes down to what it means to present facts in a courtroom. And facts are the difference between, can you prove this crime beyond a reasonable doubt? How can you, and that's why people bring up if you can't have evidence and you can't have witnesses, no defense attorney wants to walk into a courtroom and not be able to see the facts and then get the best deal, the best, outcome for their client that they can. But to equate what's going on now, and I wish that defense attorneys would, rally and talk about this, and I think in the days to come they will. But this is something you said in the beginning. The problem is in part process. When you talk about thinking about a strike, when others talk about thinking in the Pentagon, talk about how to think about any kind of warfare, the idea of a procedural happening in which different experts weigh in, the equities are, it doesn't seem that that's happening in this administration. And so, substance aside, is there a way, and many of not just the State Department, many of the agencies have been gutted, either by design or by attrition of people leaving. And, what will it, I'm just asking you this and then we're going to go to questions, what is it going to take to rebuild? It's not just about somebody coming in and saying, okay, we're going to be the lawful administration. This is an institutional structural, or am I being too much of a doomsayer? Or do you think this is taken on some kind of structural significance?
Well, there's, again, so much here. I just think that there are too many people, both in government as well as in America, who knowingly do the wrong things or allow wrong things to happen because it's in their best self-interest to do so. And I think we have to get back to some, sort of basic issues of what is right and wrong. But if one's philosophy is you lie, you cheat, you steal, you kill, you do whatever you can in order to win and prevail, and that's okay in government, boy, we are really at a very bad place right now. And unfortunately, I see too much of this right now in the chambers of Congress where, and again, I'm not a Republican or a Democrat, but I have seen a cravenness among the Republicans right now that I have never, ever, not only have I never seen it in my life, I never thought we would get to this point where these individuals would do their absolute best to conceal what a witness to these events might say. And they're going to try to do everything possible by pressure, cajoling, intimidating individuals, and the fact that Donald Trump and others really threaten people and will go after them if they happen to go against them. This is not what our republic is supposed to be. So, it's, again, the issue of just having some more on the ethical front, the principle front, the civics front, the decency front. We are right now, I think, struggling as a country.
Well, on those encouraging words, we're going to take a few questions, not a lot. Frank? Wait for the microphone.
I was having a conversation with a source I
You
trust a few
identify
years
yourself?
ago. I'm sorry?
You identify yourself?
Oh, my name is Jack Jarman.
Thank you.
I graduated here, but I taught IR at Penn.
You graduated here, too. Go ahead.
I was having a conversation a few years ago with a source I trusted in Paris. He was a member of the Sorbonne, and he also did documentaries for French TV. And we were talking about the incident where Trump called a strike on the Syrian air base in retaliation for Hussein's gassing his own people. I don't know if I know you remember that, and other people in the room remember that. And the theory he posited was, and it was a popular one, at least in Europe, it wasn't Trump who called that strike at all. It was the Saudis. And it was the Saudis' way of saying, we're in the Oval Office. And it was a message to the region. How does that theory square with what you know or what you've heard? And it must be an awful crowded Oval Office by now. But it was a frightening thing, and I just want to know from anybody in the panel what your comments might be.
I have not heard that at all. I think when they decided to take that strike, it was a way to send a clear message to Bashar al-Assad that, we're not going to allow you to continue to do it. It really didn't take out Assad's capabilities, but it was a signal, certainly. When President Obama drew the red line in saying he was going to strike if they used it, events changed then very quickly as far as the Syrians being willing to give up their CW capability, and the Russians signed on to it. So when people say that, well, Trump followed through with it, but Obama didn't, I really think you're talking in many respects apples and oranges, because the Israelis and we, for many, many years, were very concerned about Syria's chemical weapons arsenal, which was significant. And here were the Russians that were willing to agree and help to oversee the destruction of that arsenal. So there was a tremendous net gain from the standpoint of what happened there, as opposed to a couple of pinpricks. But, there's something to be said for Trump's predictable unpredictability. And if it's used the right way, you can keep your adversaries sort of off balance, because you don't know, is this guy really foolish enough to do something like this? So, but I hadn't heard about the Saudis weighing in on that.
Other questions? Over here. Yes, you. Yes, you. Wait for the microphone. Identify yourself.
Mr. Brennan, thank you for coming. I'm Ryan DeCorpo. I'm a journalist with America Magazine. Much of the United States' use of drones for tactical operations were pioneered by you and others during the Obama administration. And now President Trump has used these weapons in a way that you have characterized as illegal, not having a legal basis.
I talked about the Soleimani strike.
Right.
Okay, that's as opposed to striking against terrorist organizations.
Right.
Would be the previous administration, this one.
Right. My question is, how realistic is it to impose legal restraints on the use of drones, on the use of these weapons, once these programs now find themselves in the hands of another administration or another commander-in-chief, as we have now?
Well, why should it be any different than any other weapon that might be in the U.S. arsenal. I think whether you're talking about drones or whether you're talking about a tank or an aircraft or cruise missiles, there needs to be some type of understanding about under what conditions and circumstances and what considerations do you take into account when you do that. And again, you can distinguish between the targets, between unlawful combatants and combatants. You can distinguish between areas of hot battlefields like Iraq or Afghanistan. You can distinguish between those countries that are, or groups that are covered under the authorization for the use of military force. But I think irrespective of the weapon system or the capability, there needs to be some type of legal and policy framework that you're going to exercise them. Now, one can argue also that you have the overt use of those capabilities and the covert use of those capabilities. Well, I don't think anybody ever should be using covert capabilities just to avoid any type of either opprobrium, internationally or domestically, about what you do. And so, I do think that there are some important questions to be asked. But I think, again, any weapon system has to be nested within a broader strategic framework and legal framework that governs their use.
Other questions? This woman over here.
Thank you. My name's Miranda. I work in the financial sector. You talked about an eye for an eye and sort of a less attributable way that Iran might respond. I was wondering what your thoughts on the Michael DeAndrea news, not news, might be.
Well, there was a U.S. military E-3 surveillance aircraft that came down in Taliban territory. And whether it was hostile fire or something else, I think, is to be determined. I think the U.S. government has acknowledged that there were at least 2 U.S. military officers on there. I know the Iranians put out some press claiming that there were people on board there that they were naming and may have been belonging to another organization. I think those Iranian claims are specious. And it looks as though, again, it was an awful mishap and a tragedy that that E-3 surveillance plane came down.
Over here. Over there, the guy in the...
Hello, Mr. Brennan. I'm David Myers. I'm in the history department at Fordham, and I have 2 very quick questions. The first is why you have such faith in the idea that Donald Trump is now an aberration, given the kinds of powers that President and the Congress are giving him. Why would Elizabeth Warren give them back? That's one question. And the other question is another simple one. Do you think that given the failure of all of these good-minded, good-hearted, intelligent servants to stop Donald Trump in the aftermath of the Ukraine scandal, do you think that we are now at the end of any kind of whistleblower revelations for the duration of Donald Trump's presidency and therefore at the end of any kind of attempt to stop him?
On your first question, when I said that Donald Trump is an anomaly, I was speaking historically in terms of so far. I wonder what his demonstrated actions and experience might portend for a future president. I don't know. You say now that the Congress has given him so much authority. I don't know whether Congress has given it to him or Congress has just allowed him to, again, use, the tremendous inherent powers of the President of the United States and wield it in a way that the Republican majority in the Senate has allowed him to continue to use. So whether or not a Warren or somebody else, would be different. Second question was whistleblowers. I certainly hope not. Clearly, though, what Mr. Trump and Rand Paul, who never misses an opportunity to grandstand and to hurt this country, and I'm so glad that Chief Justice Roberts refused to ask his question at the impeachment hearing, although Rand Paul then tweets out the exact question.
Of course.
This is a dereliction of duty, responsibility on the part of individuals who have raised their hand and swore an oath. And they did the Pledge of Allegiance right before the hearing, as they do every time. So I'm hoping that intelligence officers or officers within the government are still going to do what is right. And if they see whether it be politicians or anybody, violating laws and doing things that are antithetical to what this country is based on, I sure as hell that they hope they speak up. And it can be costly. And people are going to come after you. It's been costly for me. People come after me. But sometimes, maybe it's my Fordham training or my Irish temper or any other number of those things, but I feel that I have no choice but to speak out because what's happening now is wrong. And if you're a person in the intelligence community and you see things wrong, speak up and speak out because it's the right thing to do.
Director Brennan, thank you for a very, very good evening. China has become notably adept at moving in to take advantage of power vacuums, like we're seeing right now with the IRGC. An awful lot of times they're doing it under cover of the Belt and Road. Do you see them moving into Iran and taking a more powerful role in there?
I think Xi Jinping is a very, very cunning leader and very strategic and looks at things in a much longer term. Of course he can, because he doesn't have these election cycles that he has to, sort of worry about. And he also he's head of party, head of government, and head of military. And maybe it's because of their dynastic tradition that China does take a long-term approach. But the Belt and Road Initiative is one that has a very long-term horizon to it. And we've even seen it over the last 15 years evolve. Initially, it was just based on going after trade and business, commercial opportunities. But then the Chinese realized that the instability and conflict and other types of things in these areas really have the potential to disrupt their economic opportunities. So when there's war in Libya or Yemen or Iraq, Afghanistan, you name it, a lot of Chinese companies and Chinese workers have to pull up stakes. So what have the Chinese done? They have now ingratiated themselves with a lot of the locals, and they're providing support, security and intelligence and military assistance. And as the U.S. seems to be retreating from its global responsibilities, Russia and China are seizing now opportunities. So a lot of governments, look in Africa or South Asia, that's why the Chinese have naval port facilities in Djibouti and also in Pakistan and are spreading their wings. They are trying to support their political and economic objectives with a military, intelligence, and security presence. And countries and institutions and organizations are saying, okay, if the United States alternative is not there, they will take it. They will take the Chinese offer.
My name is Bahar. I'm an undergrad student at Fordham Law School. So 2 days after the Soleimani killing, the Iraqi parliament voted to expel all foreign troops, including U.S. troops, and for violating Iraqi sovereignty. And I was wondering if you think it's time for U.S. troops to leave Iraq, and if the 2014 agreement with U.S. and Iraq allows Iraq to ask U.S. troops to leave?
Well, I do think that the United States troops should not be there unless the recognized Iraqi government says that we should be there. I think the U.S. troops that are there should be there. I'm not saying necessarily the same numbers or what they're doing, but I do think it's important because Iraq is still evolving and trying to get out of the throes of this, great conflict that they had. And if you take away the U.S. military presence, the chances that the Iraqi military and others are going to flourish, I think, diminishes significantly. But even though the Iraqi parliament said, the U.S. forces should get out, Trump made very clear, well, we're going to force you to pay for that air base that we built there that was in our interests, in order to protect, what we wanted to accomplish there. The United States should not be able to just dictate to other countries because we have that power. I don't think that during the Obama administration that we should have pulled out the way we did. I know the Iraqi government didn't want us to stay, but I think we could have negotiated a little bit more and better. But I do think it's important for the United States to continue to retain some presence there. Same thing in Afghanistan. I think we have a responsibility and obligation to try to continue to nurture and develop those forces and allies that really are in the situation they're in, the Iraqis, because of a very, very ill-fated decision on the part of Washington. And so what we have seen in the Middle East over the last 15 years is a direct product of that, absolutely. And so I don't think we should, get out, but I think we have to make sure that we're talking with the Iraqis and the Iraqis understand what we're doing and that they approve it.
One more question right here.
The microphone's
Wait
coming.
for the microphone, please. And then we're done.
My name is Susan Graber, and I'm an attorney. Didn't go to school here. My question is kind of the elephant in the room. What do you think Trump will do if he loses the election? And do you think there'll be violence in this country? People are saying there'll be a civil war. People are saying he stocked the courts, and he'll pull a Bush. Thank you.
Well, I don't want to be in the business of forecasting. I think it's dangerous. I am very concerned about what Mr. Trump represents. The polarization that's going on in this country right now is, I think, eating away at us as a country. And unfortunately, and I've seen this happen around the world, demagogues who will seize upon populist sentiment, and then they get themselves in office one way or another, and they co-opt the media, they co-opt the institutions of government, the judiciary, the intelligence security services. They continue to sell their snake oil and suppress the opposition, and which makes then very polarized situations. We have that here in this country. So as much as I detest the things that Mr. Trump is doing, he's reflecting, unfortunately, and fueling, I think, a lot of this polarization that's in this country. Michael Cohen, his former attorney, said in the hearings on the Hill that he was very concerned what Donald Trump might do if he was not reelected. I don't know, we were just talking before about the tremendous powers and authorities that a president has in his hands. What happens if something, things start to go south, with the economy, whatever else, and on the eve of the election, it looks like Trump is definitely going to lose. What might he try to do, exercising the authorities of a president of the United States? In 2016, when we were dealing with the Russian interference election, President Obama tried everything possible not to do anything at all that would somehow influence the outcome of the election. We didn't want to help the Russians achieve their aim, which was to undermine the integrity of the election. And so I just hope and pray that the people in responsible positions in government today, in the executive branch and the legislative branch and the judicial branch, will not allow things to happen at the very top of our government that truly could have a devastating and long-lasting impact on this country. So what I've seen unfold over the last 2 weeks, though, in Congress, makes me wonder, is there a line that Trump passes that Mitch McConnell and others will say, no? What is that line? That line keeps moving. And so as we get closer to the election, and a lot of things that can happen even on the international front, are they going to allow Mr. Trump to do whatever he thinks he needs to do in order to continue in office? Because Alan Dershowitz says if the incumbent believes that his continuation in office or re-election is in the best interest of the country, basically he should be allowed to do anything. My God. That is just, it's astounding to even hear that. So, yeah, we're on in a direction here that is just going, So,
Okay,
yeah, sorry.
I never like to end on a bad note. I always, seriously, you make. So,
Then why'd you ask me here tonight?
But, let me think. I'm going to channel the good note. The good note is that, there is a theory of American history that Arthur Schlesinger and his father had, that the United States travels historically in cycles. And those cycles, first they thought they were 50 years, but then they got their act together and it was 30 years. And, you know, we may be off kilter. There are some of us who think we are, but maybe not. Maybe we'll come back again through another cycle, but it's going to take a lot of work. So we're going to look to people like you to help us with that work. And the good news is we're going to bring you back when the dust settles and we're starting to enter this next cycle. And you'll talk to us about how to think about it. So
I don't want to leave this sense that I worry about what's ahead, but I am optimistic. This is a tremendously resilient country. And we are, but we have to keep our eyes open about what the challenges are and the pitfalls are that are ahead of us. But at the same time, you know, every day there is some type of engineering wonder or medical breakthrough or all the things that make our lives better than they were yesterday. And, you know, a lot of that, most of that, if not all of that, is taking place irrespective of what's going on in Washington. So I think we have to make sure that we understand that there are issues that we have to address. And again, I will still say that's one of the great things that when I come back to Fordham, I really felt that my years at Rose Hill really embedded in me a tremendously strong sense of the distinction between right and wrong. And I think that we need to get back to some of that. And this country is built on what is right in terms of allowing people to be able to have, you know, control over their future as opposed to being under the thumb of a monarch. So I really do believe that we have a very bright future ahead of us. There are some choppy seas, but there is blue skies ahead. Is that okay, Karen? Is that good?
thank you.